the name of your show is The Fallen State.
Right. The Fallen, FALLN, the Fallen State.tv.
TheFallenState.tv.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? What is the fallen state? Can you elaborate on what that is?
Human beings are in a fallen state. Everyone who is born of their mothers are in a fallen state. They have been turned away from God.
Okay, can you stop me for it? What do you mean born of their mothers?
The scripture says that all who are born of the woman are dying, and those who are born of the man, of the father, are living. Because when you're born of the mother, you're born into sin, meaning that you're born into anger. You take on the mother's identity.
Is there any person
You're
not
born
born of their mother?
Not one. That's why it says all human beings are born of sin. And so you're born innocent, but the mother turned you away from your earthly father. And as a result, she's turning you away from God, because if you don't love your earthly father, you cannot love God.
Okay, now that's amazing.
Yeah, because God said, how can you say you love me and you never see me and you hate your father?
I thought it was you hate your brother.
And your father. And
It's your brother.
it speaks about the brother too in the Bible, that we should love one another, not hate one another. But unless you love your earthly father, you can never love anyone.
All right.
Because you got to overcome the nature of your mother in order to be born of the father. And when you're born of the father, your heart is changed from anger to love.
Okay, so
Because
just to
women-
be clear, it
women are
definitely.
angry.
Okay, we're gonna get into that. That's a lot. That's a mouthful. I mean, it's that the scripture is your brother. I'm pretty comfortable there. But
It says it both.
Okay.
It talks about loving one.
so
Your
then
brother.
let's talk about you were from the South, right?
Yes.
And you're from Alabama, obviously.
Sweet Home, Alabama.
Sweet. That's one of my favorites. Being from the Bible Belt, like religious upbringing is paramount, right? So can you kind of explain what was your religious upbringing like? And
I was a Baptist, and fortunate for me, my parents didn't make a big deal of it. You know, we would go to church on a Sunday, and at the church that we attended, they would only have church once a month at the particular church. If we wanted to go to church more than that, we would have to go to another church. And most of the churches in Alabama had it once a month instead of every Sunday. And so I was born a Baptist. We went to church once a month, and that was it. They weren't into all praising the Lord and carrying on like the Bible thumper Christians are today. They were about being right and doing right. And so even when we went to church, we didn't have the Bible forced down our throat. You know, Grandma didn't take me home and make me learn the Bible or any of that kind of stuff. It was more about them being an example for us.
so it almost sounds to me like they were like nominally Christian, but then there wasn't a very strong like biblical implication there.
It was in that they lived it. They didn't just talk about it or preach it. They were like a living example of it.
So how do you feel like the religious part specifically impacted you growing up, aside from just how it directly impacted them in their lives? What about the religion directly impacted you?
The way they dealt with life. You know, I never saw them being angry and out of control. They didn't believe that the white man or anyone was better than them.
Right.
They knew that we should love God and then love our neighbors as ourselves, that it was good and evil in all races.
Okay.
And so we weren't taught to hate our fellow man because, you know, they lived that way as well. And so I didn't grow up that way. I'm glad that they didn't shove the Bible down my throat, because I've noticed that most of the Bible thumper people that know the Bible, it's hard for them to believe in God. They believe about God, but they do not believe in Him.
Okay.
And so it's difficult because their intellect has been deceived. They think learning about God is knowing God, and it's not.
I totally agree with you.
And so by not teaching me all that stuff, it made it easier for me to return to the Father.
Okay. So, well, that's interesting. We'll get into that. So you were raised on a plantation.
Yes.
By where your great grandparents had been enslaved.
Well, they weren't enslaved.
Your great grandparents weren't?
No, not that I'm aware of. I never heard anyone say that. I know that my great grandparents worked the plantation, and then when they were gone, my grandparents worked the plantation. They took care of it.
So your great grandparents were they in the 1800s?
I'm pretty sure they were.
Right.
But during that time, because blacks wasn't teaching it to hate, there was not a lot of talk about slavery and all that.
Sure, that's a different statement than whether your great-grandparents were enslaved. Because slavery, I mean, obviously it was to some people it's a distant past, but I think you can probably see that for some people it varies, right? Like for some people it's only 2 generations ago. For some people living today, for some people it's only 3 generations ago. I mean, you're
maybe 200 years ago, my great-great-great-grand, way back yonder parents were enslaved, but they didn't talk about it, so I don't know a lot about that.
okay.
And they talked about my great-grandfather. I do know that he was killed. He ran the plantation. He hired a black man that was fired from another plantation, and they tried to make him not hire them, so they eventually killed him because his wife removed the gun from the bed because she thought that he may get hurt.
Okay.
And so they were able to, the other plantation runners were able to hurt my grandfather, kill my grandfather. But even that wasn't talked about in a way that made us hate white people.
Sure, and I think that's a good thing. You shouldn't just hate white people in general.
Right.
But talk to me a little bit about growing up in the South on a plantation in the early 50s.
It was so much fun.
It was fun.
One of these days, I'm going to buy some land out in Alabama, and I'm going to create a plantation, and I'm taking blacks back to the plantation because it taught us to work with our hands. We were closer to reality because we weren't taken away by street lights and all this mess. We had to work the plantation. I can remember enjoying walking up down the road or visiting my cousins, and sometimes I would go to basketball games at my school, and I would have to walk to school at night to the game. And it was an amazing life growing up.
Okay.
Even though the Jim Crow thing existed, we knew that the Jim Crow was about white Democrats not wanting blacks to be a part of the Democratic Party.
In the 50s.
And so they, as time went by, when that came along, I don't remember when it started. But even that wasn't an issue for us at all.
Okay. And then you were raised by your grandparents.
Yes.
And now I remember in a previous interview you had said that your mother, she had married your stepfather when she had you. At
my
what
mother
age?
got pregnant. She and my father were dating,
Mhm.
and they were teenagers, and she got pregnant.
Yeah.
And when she told my father about it, he like, no, you can't make. They had sex standing up apparently. Did you know you can make a baby standing?
Of course.
Well, he didn't know that.
Oof.
I used to think
That's
the
that
same
Southern
thing.
education there, huh?
When I was growing up, I thought you couldn't make a baby standing either. Cause look like the stuff would just run out. You know what I'm saying?
Okay. Man,
You know what I
listen, I think that's Southern education.
Yeah. And so
Being
he was
50s
like,
in the
no, we
South.
were standing. I can't make no baby standing.
That's,
And so she ended up, because it was an embarrassment, at that time, black people were embarrassed about having children out of wedlock. And so she married my stepfather before I was born. And that way I would not have been born out of wedlock.
right.
So,
And
yeah.
so then when did you move with your grandparents?
She and my stepfather eventually moved to Indiana, to Gary, Indiana. And I didn't want to go.
How old
I
were you
wanted
at
to
that
stay
point?
in Alabama.
How old were
And
you?
so I stayed with my grandparents.
How old were you at that point?
If I remember, I may be off about the age, but maybe a teenager, like 12, 13, somewhere in there, I think.
Okay.
Maybe a little younger, but somewhere in there. But I knew I didn't want to go to Indiana.
Okay.
I knew I didn't want to go.
So, what was your relationship like with your mom? growing
It was
up?
good.
Okay.
You know, I would go visit during the summer and visit my mother and go see my father up there. And it was good. My mother, if you saw my mother, you would think that she's a really, well, she dead now. She dead. But,
Why'd you say it like that?
like what? She dead.
Yeah. That,
She is.
okay.
She was a nice Christian woman,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but because she didn't like my father, she didn't want me to have anything to do with him either. So I thought I loved her, but I resented her and didn't realize that's what it was because she was trying to turn me away from my father.
I see.
Yeah.
And did your father never? Did you not go visit your dad at all?
I did. I would sneak around and see him because what happened was, as a kid, I wanted my father. Inside of my body, I had this yearning for my father. So I would ask my grandparents about him. and he lived up north, Indiana as well. So whenever he would go to Alabama, come down to Alabama, he would sneak around and see me. But my mother didn't know it.
He had to sneak.
Yeah, my grandmother would have him, allow him to come.
Mm.
And whenever he show up, it was like God showed up, right? And when he would leave, I would miss him again. And so when I went up to Indiana, I would go see him as well.
Okay. And you eventually left your grandparents and moved in with your mother. How old were you at that point?
I left home, Alabama, at 18 when I finished high school. And so I went up to Indiana. I stayed there for I lived in Indiana for a year once, though, off and on in Chicago. But I left home at 18, went to Indiana, got a job because I wanted to come back to California. So I got a job. I worked for 2 weeks, made my first paycheck, and moved out here.
Wow. That sounds
Isn't that
like
amazing?
No, that's how my grandfather did it. He
Yeah.
got a little job, moved out here to California from Oklahoma.
Yeah, that's how men used to be. They didn't rely on mama. They didn't live with mama until they were 19, 20, and 30, and 40, and 50.
Well, yeah.
They left mama, right?
Yeah.
And they went out because we were raised that way. Not to, when you become 18, you become a man.
For sure.
So you got to go out and deal with life, and that's the mentality I had then and have now.
Okay. I respect that. It's
Yeah.
it's a good
But they
good
weren't
outlook.
beta males like the men are today.
Right.
Have you noticed that?
Can you say beta for me one time?
Beta.
There we go. Now, beta males is one thing, but some of your conversations surrounding black women in particular have been pretty antagonistic. I think you referred to black women as bitter and angry.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Can you reiterate your stance? Where does that come from?
Well, black women are angry. They're out of control. They are on a worse ego trip than any other time in history. And the reason is they have not had fathers to guide them. Their fathers were not there because their mothers turned them away. And also the black men that they come in contact with are not men. And the black man worship the woman as though she's God because he has not overcome his mother. And so every woman get involved with his mama, and he doesn't know how to deal with the spirit of the woman because he's not dealt with the spirit of his mother. And so the women are suffering because they don't have the light of the man to guide them. It's like if we didn't have Christ in our life, the men, we would be suffering because we would not have Christ to guide us. Where the black women need men to guide them, and that's why they're so angry and out of control.
Okay. So, I love it. Do you feel, tell me if this is fair, do you think some of your anger towards black women or some of your views of black women, do you think that has anything to do with your relationship with your mother and being bitter towards her about like kind of keeping you from your father?
Well, first of all, I'm not angry. I have no anger.
Right.
So I'm not
Change
angry
that.
or bitter toward them at all.
Oh, okay.
Because when, you know how God said that when you forgive, he will forgive you? So I went and forgave my mother for trying to turn me away from my father.
How old
And
were you when that happened?
I was 38.
Okay.
And when I forgave her, God forgave me. He took her identity away and gave me back my father's identity.
Okay. So,
And
but
so
until
when
38, you were angry
I was
towards
angry.
your mother.
Yeah.
And so
But
that
I didn't
was-
even know it though because I felt that emotional love that come from anger. And I thought I loved her. And I didn't realize that I resented her until God allowed me to see that anyone that has anger is emotional. And that emotion is not good. It's straight out of hell. There's no love. That's not love at all.
So anger is straight out of hell.
It's straight out. Anyone that has anger, Satan is their daddy.
Okay.
You could bank on that.
Okay.
And they're very emotional. They're up and down emotional.
Right.
They're shy and insecure.
We
They-
talked about anger on your show
Yeah.
when I was on the Fallen State.
Right.
And you mentioned that God had wrath, right? I mentioned that God had
yeah,
wrath,
'cause
and
I
you
don't know.
agreed, right?
Well, what do you mean by God has wrath?
Well, there's like several scriptures. Obviously, like Jesus was filled with wrath when he like turned over the tables, for the people that were changing money. God has mentioned. That
What
he
does
had
wrath
anger.
mean, though? What does the word wrath mean? I don't know what that means. I heard it, but I don't
You
know what
said
it
wrath
means.
came from anger.
Right, but Jesus did not have anger. You can't be a son of God and
Does
have
God
anger.
have anger?
No.
Are there any scriptures in the Bible that say he had anger?
I know there's somewhere in the Bible where it says Jesus was, I guess it says Jesus was angry, right? But you have to realize that the people who wrote the Bible are traitors to good. They're just not the beginning. The Bible today is not the Bible that was way back then during Paul days and others.
So
It has been
wait.
rewritten down
I hear
through the
you. So
generation.
you're basically saying that, like, so if the Bible does, because it's obviously the scriptures are replete. Like, obviously in Numbers, like he said that he was angry, and God was angry at all the tribes except for the tribe of Judah. Like there are clearly scriptures that obviously say that God had anger, right?
But God's anger is not emotional anger,
So,
like
so
the
wait,
Father state anger.
So anger in itself, you said, was always just the nature of Satan.
Yes.
But God can have anger that is not the nature of Satan.
God has discernment. He sees injustice, and he take care of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't hate it in the way that.
But he has anger
in the
towards
way that no, it's discernment.
So does God have anger?
I said no, man. What
Okay,
the-
I got it. Listen, I'm sorry. I haven't. We were going to discuss this later on in the conversation, but I do have a specific scripture. I didn't memorize it.
God is love.
Mm-hmm.
He's not anger. Satan is hate.
Okay.
He's angry.
Really quickly, Numbers 32 and 13. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years until the entire generation of those who had done evil in the sight of the Lord was destroyed. And one more example, really quickly. So the Lord was very angry with Israel. This is in 2 Kings 17:18, and removed them from his sight. None was left except the tribe of Judah. So clearly, and I mean, these are just two examples that are clearly talking about God having anger.
But he didn't have that Satan anger. He had discernment.
So he did have anger. So just to be clear, does God have anger?
No.
So this scripture is wrong?
Yes. The scripture is not wrong, but the one that wrote the scripture is wrong.
Okay.
God had discernment, and that's why in order to enter the kingdom of heaven within, he must take away the anger that you have first.
Okay.
Because anger is of Satan. It is evil.
Okay, so this is the book of Jesse, 3rd chapter, 2nd verse?
And
you're making this up off the top of your head.
No,
the scriptures don't say
you
this.
wouldn't understand that until you overcome anger.
Okay.
Because human beings identify, because they're intellectual, they identify anger as meaning the feeling that they have. That's what God must have. That's not true.
Okay.
That's why he said we cannot hate. We cannot have that. We have discernment instead of anger. The children of Satan has anger. The children of God has discernment.
Okay.
We are able to see injustice.
Well, we entirely disagree on that one. So we'll move on. So let's talk about...
Are you a Christian?
Of course. We'll get
You have anger?
I think we discussed this before, and I would say yes, I do have anger.
So how can you have anger and be of God?
Well, because I think God has anger too. You can have righteous indignation.
Oh, okay. So you think he has it?
Well, the scripture clearly detailed it. But we got to move on because of time. So we're going to talk a little bit about your dad, okay?
Okay.
On the dialogue, when you were in the dialogue with Starlet Quarles, you had mentioned like your dad briefly. How did your relationship with your dad impact you growing up?
When I found out what really happened, and my father and I became one, and it's like that void that I had was fulfilled. I no longer had the emptiness. And it was just amazing.
Okay.
It was really, really amazing.
Okay.
Even when he expired, it was as though he did not die. I noticed his body was gone, but I can sense that he and I are still one.
Okay. And then, and I can see that you know you being one with your dad, and like having that kind of having that yearning and all those things, and then your mother like kind of doing that, like keeping you from him and all that stuff. I can see where that can lead to.
All children go through that. There's not one that doesn't.
Well, I don't know. I wasn't angry or bitter towards my dad, per se.
Most adults don't resent their fathers; they resent the mother. But the mother made them think they resent the father because she played victim, and she made you think, "Oh, I had you, I raised you, I took care of you. Your dad didn't do this."
Sure.
And she would cause you to identify with her, and you would see your father the way that she sees him. But if you're not conscious enough, you think that those are your feelings when they're really not. Okay. Most adult and children love their fathers. They're yearning. That's what that void is about.
Sure.
All of them are yearning for their fathers. That's why God said there will come a day when I'll return the children to the fathers and the fathers to the children. Everybody yearns for the father.